I want to welcome everyone as we kick off Module 3 today of our series on Interconnected Systems Framework, Systems, Data, and Practices. My name is Kelsey Schmitz. I work for the University of Washington at the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, or the SMART Center. I'm the School Mental Health Lead to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So our funder, SAMHSA, asked that we provide this disclaimer that the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So the University of Washington SMART Center and the Northwest MHTTC acknowledge that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral grounds of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. The Pacific Southwest, who we are hosting this webinar series with, is led by the Center for Applied Research Solutions, and they have offices across California and Sacramento, the land of the Nisenan people, Santa Rosa, the land of the 8 Cahuilla bands, and Los Angeles, the land of the Tongva peoples. CARS acknowledges the belonging of this land to the indigenous people named and the unrecognized tribes and peoples as well. And we hope that you will take some time to learn about the ancestral lands that you're joining us from. So as many of you know, because I see lots of familiar names joining us today, the MHTTC network was funded by SAMHSA in late 2018. And includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. This series is being sponsored by 2 regional centers, the Pacific Southwest and the Northwest MHTTCs. We know that we have several of you that are on from outside of our region, and just want to make sure you know how to reach the MHTTC regional center near you. And again, we'll save time at the end for you to complete the evaluation. All right, so just as a quick review, for those of you who might be new, or it's been a while since you've been with us. Last October, October of 2019, we started a series of webinars and discussion hours that were based off the Interconnected Systems Framework fact sheets. And we want to make sure that you have access to all of that introductory material. And these sessions are really building on those introductory materials, the fact sheets and the webinars. So this year we've done a better job blending the systems, data, and practices sessions from last year into a series for more integrated programming to provide some deepened content. We have a total of 4 sessions led by Susan Barrett and other field experts, and 6 sessions with University of Southern California staff. And then we'll wrap things up with a town hall style format where we'll bring everybody back together in January. Susan's sessions will focus more on the systems and structures, pulling heavily from the newly released ISF implementation guide, and USC sessions will again focus on the practices. You are welcome to attend just the systems and data sessions with Susan's, or just the practices, or you can attend both of those. So on this slide, you can see where we've been and where we're headed. We're about halfway through. And it's great that we have so many of you on that have been with us along the way. Our next session will be Thursday. Beth Cooney will lead us in virtual adaptations for 2 evidence-based trauma interventions in schools. So we recognize that there is a lot of acronyms and abbreviations that we use in this work. So here are some common acronyms and abbreviations that you will hear today. So just take a moment to review that and know that you can refer back to us. If we happen to use an acronym or an abbreviation that you're not familiar with, let us know in the chat and we'll make sure we provide that information for you. So now I want to introduce our speakers for today. We have Susan Barrett with us, who's the director of the Center for Social Behavioral Supports at Old Dominion University, and Dr. Jessica Swain Bradway, who's the executive director of Northwest PBIS. Glad to have both of you here with us. And I think we will hand it off to Susan, who will get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you for being with us today. We have a ton of slides to get through in a short amount of time. And so let's start. Jessica and I will be sharing the duties today, presenting with you. And we're hoping that you engage with us to the extent possible on chat. So if you've got questions, Jessica's going to monitor the chat box while I'm talking. And then when Jessica has her turn, I'll monitor the chat box. So feel free to ask questions and engage with us. And we'll get started. The purpose of today's module, I remember on module 3, so we'll do a really quick review of module 1 and module 2. We want to focus on the systems structures for developing the advanced tiers. And so we're going to talk about the expanded school teaming process. We're going to talk about how the meeting agenda should support and document the problem-solving process with our expanded team. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to use data to guide decisions. And then finally, we'll leave you with some resources, some discussion guides and activities to strengthen your advanced tier system as you kind of redesign or reimagine how we support the increasing number of our children and youth who need a lot more from us than ever before. Before we get started, I just want to pause and make sure that we are taking care of each other in this space and during this time. We are recognizing how stressed everyone is during the COVID era with multiple crises that we are confronting. And so one of the things that we do within our PBIS work is as a way to create community, we bring everyone together and we create common language, common expectations, and common behaviors that we want to see from each other. And this really helps set the stage for strengthening a pro-social community. And so we want to honor that tradition by expanding on that to really reflect out what we need the adults to be doing right now. And so we've listed out some self-care expectations and self-care behaviors. And in doing so, really trying to create that collective care that we want to see throughout our organizations that we are in. And so to that end, in order for us to be safe, we want to be able to create emotional support teams for one another. Who are your go-to people? We are all learning in this space. We're all in this new frontier together, and we need an emotional support team to increase our skills and knowledge in this space and time together, but also to laugh and cry and just be with one another. Right now, as we enter in this phase of our crisis, and specifically around the holiday season, we want to make sure that we're extra cautious and careful, and we're double checking on our friends, and that we're asking for help if we personally feel a sense of hopelessness. We want to be engaged with our stress level in our bodies and be able to create space to recognize and name the emotions that we're experiencing, pay attention to moments of joy and moments of celebration. We want to make sure that we're pausing and doing body checks for areas of tightness and discomfort, and that we're mindful of taking many more movement breaks than ever before and hydrating and nourishing our bodies. And we're respecting ourselves in that space too by choosing and selecting more healthy food options. And I'm working on that as my personal goal, building calming routines prior to sleep and building routines for daily exercise. So just really want to hold that space for the people on this call and make sure that we are creating a platform of emotional support and care for the adults that are really the caregivers in this movement of change. I want to just do a really quick recap of the big ideas from Module 1. A lot of things happen in between our times together, and we want to make sure that we're honoring what has happened prior before we launch into a discussion around systems in Tier 2, Tier 3. So some of the big ideas that we captured prior was that we had a mental health crisis before COVID, we are likely to see that behavioral health symptoms are going to increase over time. They're likely to be seen in phases as a result of the current crisis or multiple crises that we find ourselves in. This increased need COVID rather, has really exposed the social inequities in our country. And we know that because of those social inequities that have permeated the system for many, many decades, there's an increased need with responding to COVID because it's absolutely impacting our Black, Brown, and migrant communities at a much higher rate. It's time to redesign the system. I never want to go back to the way things were because it was not working for many, many of our students. And so it's time to disrupt status quo and redesign the system and create a platform within our teaming sessions and to call each other out on never going back to the way things were. I wanted also to reflect on the fact that we're seeing there's the silver lining that's happening, and we're seeing some really incredible sample responses. We're seeing many more places across the country hiring social emotional experts. We're thinking about them, though, to deliver individualized or intensive supports right now, and certainly there is a need for that. We're seeing some other sample responses like buying social emotional curriculum and really paying attention to how we weave that into the fabric of education. We're seeing a lot more training on trauma-informed practices. And we've seen a really big shift in the strengthening of partnerships, especially with our families and other community providers, as we try to reimagine this landscape as we try to handle the kind of sheer magnitude of the crisis that we're facing right now. In the next slide, though, I want to be really clear. While I'm giddy that these responses are occurring in real time as we speak, right? They will not be enough to handle the magnitude of the problem. So we're going to need those core features that we've established within the multi-tiered system of support to amplify that yes, we need to hire more social emotional experts, but we need those experts to work differently in the system. For example, we need those social emotional experts to participate across all tiers of implementation and support. Right now, we need to focus on strengthening our Tier 1 system so that we meet the vast majority of need, and that when students need more from us, we're not automatically assuming it's an intensive need, but we're focused on Tier 2 system and sorting groups of students by common needs. Otherwise, we are going to be completely overwhelmed. We also need to, when we're hiring our social emotional experts, we need to adapt their role to build out the capacity of many more instructional staff to be involved in teaching mental health skills and strategies right alongside our academic content. So we need to reposition them. When we select our social emotional behavior curriculum, we need that team to have a formal process and make a decision as a team on what curriculum we're going to choose for our kids. Does it match developmental needs? Does it match the culture and context of who we're serving? And we need to use data from our own communities to prioritize which skills we start with. Again, we need all of our instructional staff to feel much more competent and confident to teach, model, and practice right alongside our academic content. Yes, we do need to train staff on trauma-informed practices, but we need time and space to figure out how to apply that new knowledge into our strategic plan. As a math teacher, what am I going to say and do differently as a result of learning about trauma-informed care? How is that going to change what I do on a daily basis, and how do we track fidelity and make sure that it's making an impact. And finally, yes, we need to strengthen our partnerships, but we need to use that problem-solving logic, use that data, and actively pursue and uncover what the needs are and quickly move into action. So we were talking in the last module about launching from a PBIS framework. And we coined a term called Interconnected Systems Framework. And we gave you and offered you the definition, where the ISF is a deliberate application of the multi-tiered PBIS framework to bring in all of the social emotional behavior interventions into one umbrella, one single system of care. We want to align those across the cascade of implementation. So we want to create a common way of work, and we want to use those core features throughout this alignment. We want the alignment to occur at the district level so it doesn't fall on the shoulders of the implementers. And we want it to be actively guided by our family and our youth and our community partners. So we need to bring and expand those other members into the work that we've already established through PBIS, but really make the families and youth and community members leaders in this space, so that we can adapt to fit the needs, and we've got an expanded context of what's going on beyond the school day for our students. In the next slide, we offered 4 key messages. So we talked about having one set of teams. We talked about defining success by the outcomes and not simply counting the number of students who are receiving services. That's way too general. We want to get really explicit about what's going to happen, what will be different. What are we going to say and do differently as the adults? And what are kids going to, what skills and strategies are they going to utilize? And how will this impact their life? So we need success to be defined by the outcomes and the student benefit ultimately. 3, mental health is for all. I think we don't have to sell that anymore. We all know we need skills and strategies to navigate the stressors of life, and we also need to be incorporating skills and strategies to navigate the life right into the academic setting. And 4 MTSS core features are essential to install school mental health approach. So that was the recap for Module 1. In Module 2, we switched over and talked about really specific practices that were trauma-informed, and we highlighted a resource that's fairly new out there, a practice guide. So in Module 2, we highlighted those practices, and in the next slide, we talked about the amount of money and resource and time investment in trauma-informed approaches. We're seeing a lot, and again, it warms our hearts. We're giddy that with the focus on trauma-informed care and trauma-sensitive schools. But in the next slide, one of the things that we're realizing when we do a systematic review of the current literature, we are actually unable to demonstrate systemic or programmatic changes or outcomes in schools. So we're doing a lot of training, but we're not putting that evaluation component in it. We are unclear what schools are doing to be trauma-informed, right? We don't have a concrete vision of what that looks like and sounds like. And we're not clear on the impact of the professional development on adults, and we're not clear about the impact and professional development on students. So today's session, we're going to talk about designing a system so that a team can assess the extent to which the practices that we select are actually done with fidelity, high fidelity, that most students are benefiting from that. So these were the practices that we covered in Module 2. And again, today we're going to focus on those systems. Let's talk about systems. So systems are what we put in place to support the adults, right? So that it's not just 1 or 2 staff that are doing this in just a couple classrooms. We've really got consistent metrics and consistent ways of supporting the adults to install this in a really feasible way. We know that when we redesign the system, we are going to ask you to streamline the current system. We will de-stress the staff when we invest in a small number of evidence-based practices that match the needs for our students, and we invest in one framework and one set of teams. So this is going to be about decluttering, right? About working much more effectively and efficiently. And we're going to use the tool called the tiered fidelity inventory to strengthen our tier 1 system and start to really build the tier 2 system and incorporate those trauma-informed practices into those two system pieces. The one set of teams is going to be really important, right? How do we coalesce all of the work that's going on and put in one set of teams for each tier? So at tier 1, we are going to have a multidisciplinary team where we bring the stakeholders around and we focus on the ecosystem, right? What are we going to do as a collective to build a pro-social community within our school? They're going to coordinate and monitor support for all students, all staff across all settings. So they're going to be looking and actively uncovering patterns and trends in the data. They're going to focus on building that pro-social community, and they're going to focus on being able to quickly identify when there's a need, and they're going to be able to move quickly into tier 2 so that students don't fail for long. Too often our kids are failing and we're waiting for that failure to occur and then we respond. We want the team to actively be pursuing and uncovering what the needs are through screening metrics, so that we're always one step ahead and we're always seeing that wave coming towards us so that we can fortify and strengthen before any of our students have an opportunity to fail. And when they are sliding down a bit in a data point or we're recognizing they need additional support, we don't need a label, a diagnosis, or an insurance plan. If you need support, within 24 hours, we have a system that will trigger supports to make that happen. So this team is going to actively monitor data. They're going to develop decision rules, and they're going for when students need additional support, and they're going to constantly review that aggregate data. At tier 2, we're still going to coordinate and monitor, but we're going to focus on all of the students that are receiving tier 2 supports. We're going to ensure that when we select evidence-based practices that our students might need, right, we're going to customize to fit. We're going to make sure that we are sorting kids into groups by specific need. Too often, again, we move from having a request for assistance protocol in place and we skip over tier 2 and we individualize supports. We have to, sometimes that will be the case, but we have to make sure that we've got a tier 2 system that can handle the amount of need that's going to be out there. And so sorting kids into groups, into targeted groups, is really going to be important. And having a team dedicate themselves to being able to progress monitor that landscape is going to be essential. Similarly, we need to invest in a systems planning team at tier 3 who coordinate and monitor interventions for all students receiving those intensive individualized supports, right? So we need teams to manage the systems across the tiers, one set of teams. I want to start to offer ways of pulling in those trauma-informed enhancements into those TFI systems features. So yes, we have a team that is responsible for tier 1 implementation. And instead of forming a new team to focus on trauma-informed care, we're actually going to bring individuals who have knowledge, expertise, and the ability to provide coaching supports around trauma. We're going to bring them into the existing team. We're going to make sure that when we are using a problem-solving agenda and we've got team operating procedures, we're bringing in the items on the agenda through a trauma-informed lens, right? So we're not going to splinter out the work when we bring in trauma-informed care. We're going to attach it to the current system. And so we wanted to offer and highlight this resource as an example of showing how you align a trauma-informed approach into the PBIS framework. And we've captured this in those trauma-informed enhancements. And you can see we've got faculty involvement, student, family, community involvement, and data-based decision-making, and we've explicitly defined those trauma-informed enhancements. So as we lean into Tier 2, we also want to recognize that TFI offers those components to strengthen our Tier 2 system. And so we wanted to make sure that you on the call knew that these are the items that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to talk about Tier 2 teams. We're going to talk about the screening and request for assistance option approach. We're going to talk about the interventions, and Jessica's going to walk us through that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the valuation of that. So we're going to focus in on developing out Tier 2 on today's call, in addition to fortifying and strengthening Tier 1. All right, so with that, I wanted to give an example of a modified team-initiated problem-solving agenda. How can we use a common problem-solving agenda across all of the teams that we're working with? So we create common routines and common procedures. And you can see a couple of things that are highlighted in this example because we're editing it in real time right now. So for example, we are moving in and out of teaching and learning context. We're moving in face-to-face mode, and then we're moving back into remote mode. And we're going to be doing this for a while throughout this year as the COVID numbers spike, and then we get a handle on it. While we're doing that, we need to be continuing to meet as a team, even though the teaching and learning context changes. So we need to have that a through line and some level of consistency. So we're going to argue for using a common meeting agenda, no matter if we're in person or virtual. Notice the highlighted areas here. Before we move into advanced tiers, we are going to prompt the team to remember that we have to check on fidelity first. We have to do that first before we kick it up a notch for the students, right? So we're going to be looking at our status by tier, and we're using those TFI scores to reflect out our status by tier. And we have an additional fidelity metric called the ISF implementation inventory that also reminds us of the extent to which we have fidelity of implementation within an interconnected system framework. We're also going to call our attention to some data points when we meet. So we're going to have regular reviews of data. And one of those data pieces that we're going to pay critical attention to is a formal screener. And even if you're not, if you don't have a formal screener in place, there are other natural data sources that you can look to that will help us actively uncover what the needs are right now. So you can see the other information and other data also highlighted, like office referral patterns, suspension expulsion data, academic performance data, and perception data, right? Those climate, social validity types of data. So let's focus, as we think about the TFI in Tier 2, let's focus on the TFI component. So there's two features we're going to start to focus on in this next section. One is on screening. We need the Tier 2 team to use decision rules and multiple sources of data in order to progress monitor and identify when students need more from us. So we've identified the feature, the possible data sources, right? The office discipline referrals, time out of instruction, attendance rates, academic performance. How do we look at those patterns that are emerging and determine when students need more from us? What are our decision rules for access? Additionally, we need a single request for assistance protocol. And notice my words right now. I am not using the term referral. We need to limit our time when we refer kids out into the community domain, and we need to expand our teams so that we can contain our kids within our MTSS structure. So request for assistance means that we're going to keep it within the continuum to the extent possible. Even if it's a mental health need, We're going to contain that in the mental health and in the MTSS space. So the request for assistance wording is on purpose, and we are going to limit the times that we need to use a referral when things are outside of our boundary. When we expand and bring our community providers onto our school team, we will be able to do that because we're going to have the clinical expertise who will guide that path. So these are the two things we're going to focus on for this section. In the next slide, the first thing that the teams are going to do across the tiers, remember we want a single set of teams, but we also want a single team process across those tiers. We are going to gather information. So the tier 1 team is going to start that process for us. And for all kids, we need to have an adequate picture of our kids that we're working with. So we're going to gather information related to, and if you advance, we've got some things that are going to populate. We need to gather information about the strengths and interests of our kids. We need to gather information about the cultural identity of our kids, the learning history and past experiences, and we also need to uncover and know what the skill deficits and needs of our kids are. The tier of focus, that when we start to look at those patterns that are emerging, I want us to always be looking first and foremost at the trends and patterns that are emerge and look at data in the aggregate. For example, when we learn that 30% of our kids have experienced a traumatic event and we need to install trauma-informed care, that's going to be a tier 1 strategy that we're going to employ, because we're not going to be able to individualize or pull in targeted supports for all 30% of students that are enrolled in our school. It just won't be possible. So let's try to meet the vast majority of need first and foremost before we start identifying kids to receive targeted intensive supports. So the tier of focus is going to be critical. Now, I recognize that not everybody has a formal screener, but there are ways that we can uncover these through informal ways that we can uncover the need, right? So here's an example about connecting and learning about our students in real time. So on a daily basis, how do we know what our students are going through? How do we know their name? How do we know their story? How do we pronounce their name correctly? How do we track information? How do we adjust? And how do we ask for assistance? So every single teacher, so this is that systems piece. How do we strategize a really simple way for teachers to make connections with their students on a daily basis? And we've populated this to give you an example. So if I'm a classroom teacher going into Wednesday, I might look at this and say to myself, man, I need to find out more about Abby. There's a lot, I don't know something personal about her. I'm going to make it my mission tomorrow to learn something about Abby. And even if it's not in the context of the classroom, what are things that I can do that are creative right now where I can learn something more about her? So you can see really quickly when you gather this information where the gaps are in what our knowledge base is for some of our students. So Jessica, if you can scroll through, again, it's not just about 1 or 2 teachers doing this, it's about building and shaping a routine so this is consistently employed across every classroom, whether you're in virtual or in face-to-face. So how do we encourage to build a routine where there are daily checks and we give time and space to build a sense of community, to foster care and connections with each other, to deepen our connections and relationships with one another? And how do we use a metric like this to conduct a weekly review and perhaps do a Monday adjustment where I can on Friday do my weekly review, and then I as a classroom teacher am going to focus in on just a couple of students and I'm going to learn more about their story. So how do we do that at the teacher level? How do we do that at the school level? Again, across the teams of support, it's about actively uncovering the needs. There's other information that's helpful right now in terms of looking at the community data that helps us be able to prepare for what's coming at us. And so Washington State has some forecasting data that's been really helpful in letting us know what's ahead of us. And one of the things they have told us is that there will be increases in suicide ideation, increase in anxiety and depression in the months that we are in right now. And so when we know that those things are coming at us, we can actually do things prior that will mitigate the likelihood that many of our students and staff will suffer. So what information is helpful for you right now? What in real time, what are some of the data that's going to be collected that are going to inform your process? The big idea is that teams will continuously monitor the trends, looking for patterns at the population level to detect when large number of students are demonstrating similar behaviors. So when we start to see trends where we're seeing absences, we're seeing a large number of kids tardy, we're seeing a lot of self-report around anxiety. That's not going to be a tier 2 or tier 3 job. It's going to be the job of tier 1 to say, what do we need to do to strengthen and fortify our tier 1 application so that we have less number of kids that are falling into these categories. So it's always about tracking and checking fidelity first, fortifying and strengthening that tier 1 before we have that knee-jerk reaction of intensifying supports. So a couple of other big ideas and general guidelines as we dip our toes into screening. We always, even if we have a formal screener, we always want to use multiple data sources, right? We need those formal screening indicators that uncover kids with both externalizing and internalizing needs, but we also need our informal data sets. We need those attendance patterns. We need instructional time. We need work completion, right? I may have a group of students that show up on my virtual classroom each and every day, but they're not completing or turning in any work, right? What about our office referral rates or our problem behavior rates? So we need multiple data sources. We need the district leadership team to be charged with selecting the screener. We're not going to leave that to schools to decide and do for themselves. So if you don't have a formal screener right now, it's going to be the charge of the district community leadership team to start investing in selecting one that matches and is customized to fit the needs of the people that you're working with. When we're investing in the selection process, we want to make sure that we are using evidence-based screening options and that we're using the same screening tool across our schools. We want to use psychometrically sound screening tools. We need to wait to screen, though, until families and students and staff get back to a routine. So in this now time, it may be that we are moving too fast in between the virtual and face-to-face learning context that we don't feel comfortable screening right now because we haven't been able to adjust to a new routine. We haven't been able to reach fidelity of tier 1 where we are intentionally able to develop relationships. We just haven't been able to do that. That is okay. We need to wait to screen until we have an adjustment period because bias will be inherent in any of these measures because they are really our best guess and it's a perception measure. So we need to take time to develop relationships, identify strengths, connect with our kids, and that's harder to do in the remote learning context. So it's okay if you need to wait to do that formal screening this year. A couple other general guidelines when it comes to screening. We want to make sure that we understand that we take screening data in the total score, not individual items, right? And we want to make sure that we're always combining with other metrics. So it might be good to pull in some real-time data, some current family surveys, some current student information that might give you some deepened knowledge about what our families and students are going through right now. And the purpose of that data is to strengthen tier 1 instruction and to identify students who might need additional support. This is not a diagnostic assessment. Rather, it is a way for our teams to detect patterns quickly and adapt the tier 2 system to meet the majority of need. When we examine our screening data, we can start to look at what's going on at the grade level and with classroom level. And it might be that we kick it up a notch for certain grade levels. One of the things that just got revealed in a data set that I was looking at with a state, I won't name the state, somewhere in the country, one of the things that was revealed when we started to look at screening data was that middle school girls are struggling more than any other subgroup, just at a general glance. And so how do we kick it up a notch and create peer groups for those girls in those middle school years, because those are the ones that are really struggling. So it will help us allocate our resources much more effectively and efficiently when we look at those broad patterns and trends, because we can allocate and distribute our resources towards those middle school girls. Again, we want to pause and ask, how are you meeting the vast majority of needs right now? How are you meeting and reaching fidelity in this new frontier we find ourselves in this year? Are most students successful in your community? So before you start to kick it up a notch, we have to make sure that we're meeting the vast majority of need. We are going to be overwhelmed if we're not careful. So I can't emphasize enough this notion of, on a daily basis, being able to meet the vast majority of need and quickly pivoting when a student is recognized as needing more into tier 2, and being able not to need to wait for a label or diagnosis before we start to increase levels of support. Jessica, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or things coming up in chat that we need to be aware of, or ask if you want to offer any additional things that I'm missing.
There are some amens in the chat pod, and people appreciating your perspective. And we don't have any questions yet. Just big fans of no label diagnosis or insurance needed. Woot, we got a woot. Decision rules are critical to equitable decisions. Love it. April says they use Panorama for their screening. I know it's a pretty popular one in the region. Thanks for that reminder, April. It's a good one, because you can really, if I recall correctly, you can really kind of pull questions in, customize it, pull them out, that kind of thing. Yes. Karen says pass the offering. Sean says outstanding. So, okay. And everyone's being very patient with my squeaky mouse. So
there is one question that came into Q&A.
Excellent, thank you.
Amber finds that the tier 2 and tier 3 team members are similar. Can you talk a little bit about who is on each team in terms of actual roles?
Yeah, that is a great one. And there will be some overlap, but we need to clearly define the roles for the team. So we actually have some resources that I can give you that talk about who needs to be on the team. For instance, when we pull community clinicians on the team at tier 1, they're going to have much more of a consulting role at tier 1. They're going to help us figure out how to fortify and strengthen our tier 1. They're going to help build capacity of our instructional leads. At tier 2, though, they're going to still remain on the tier 2 team, but their role is going to shift. One that's going to coordinate and help perhaps even co-facilitate some of those targeted group supports. And at tier 3, they're going to provide those direct services for intensive needs. So there will be some overlap in who serves on those teams, but their roles will be really, it'll be critical for us to clearly identify how and what they're going to do across the tiers of support.
That's a great question, and thanks for your response, Susan. Really, really helpful, because I find, and I imagine a lot of other folks who do coaching and support on this call find the same thing, is that a lot of us are so ready to individually problem solve because we want to immediately address an issue for a kiddo. And we forget that very important role at tier 2 of matching kiddos to group interventions that we have already established, and we're not recreating everything. So I think that's a good question and a good reminder.
Awesome. Okay.
We have a question from Allison. Says, what would you recommend for schools that are struggling to capture the difference between engagement and attendance above the tier 1 level? How much adaptability can MTSS be in tier 2 and tier 3 throughout virtual hybrid learning?
Yeah, so, okay. You guys are, I love it. We've got some great questions here. So I think, first of all, we've got to operationally define engagement versus attendance, right? We can attend all day, right? I can be on a Zoom call, but not be engaged. And so first, we've got to operationally define that and be on the same page and create consistent metrics for being able to not only operationalize that, but calculate that. And then in terms of the adaptability for MTSS at tier 2 and tier 3 in virtual and hybrid learning, I'm going to argue that, and I'm going to give this specific example, that we have this opportunity to really push the envelope with how we teach. And so what was often happening is that every third grade teacher is teaching their own class in individual Zoom classrooms. Why are we doing that? We could be investing in having a teacher take the lead, somebody whose strengths are teaching in a virtual space, and have that one third grade teacher teach all of the third grade classes in the virtual space, and use the other teachers to increase doses of support during breakout rooms, right? So we can completely kind of reimagine how we think about increasing doses of supports in a virtual landscape, but it's going to require a different style of professional learning community for the adults, and to reconfigure how we're going about teaching in the virtual space. So I hope that's helpful to you, Allison. And Jessica, I don't know if you want to chime in on that. I think you put something in the chat.
I did it. Your response is spot on. And I want to, people ask me this question all the time around engagement, and I come back with a question, which is probably really not annoying at all to anyone. But I say, what's your valued outcome here? What protective factors are you investing in? And or are kiddos being successful with handing in work, and they're connecting with teachers, they're engaging in conversation, and now you're going to move on to a different protective factor. Where are you at with, Susan, you do a great job of talking about the density of protective factors in an environment, and how dense and how supportive can we make that? So what type of engagement are you going for? And are you going for the right engagement? At this point, I'm just going to push that back and say, what would your families say? What would your kids say? I think I quote Susan all the time. You said not that long ago, academic success is a protective factor until it's not. And I'll tell you what, for my 9-year-old who just busted in and was hoping to be on camera for a minute, finishing his Learn Zillion math lesson for my kid right now is not a protective activity. But going to the park and running around and shooting his buddy with laser blasters with their masks on, that's a protective factor. So that's going to be when people say, what's your engagement? My engagement right now is for my kid to run around and play and have fun in a safe manner. So what is it the right engagement? And where can you point, where your valued outcomes pointed, I think is what I was going for.
Yep. Awesome. Okay, so we only have 600 more slides. Okay, when you're reviewing your data and you're looking at those patterns and trends, we need to define some system level entrance criteria, thresholds, and red flags. And in our new monograph for ISF in chapter 5, we describe this in narrative form. So if you need a little bit more of a deep dive into thinking about this, and establishing this as part of what your team does, we've got some narrative that will help you. So there will be kids who need more from us. They need an additional dose of support from us. So I want you to think about dose, right? Everybody needs skills and strategies, but some of our kids are going to need increased dose of support with a smaller learning community and more time for practice and fluency, similar to how we situate academic supports in that targeted arena. There will be a smaller group of students who need more. The trick is to clearly define those thresholds and red flags to alert the team that we need to pay attention to this kid because while they're getting access to the tier 1 system and they're part of that ecosystem and they're getting acknowledged and they're being reinforced and they're engaged, we need to kick it up a notch for them. I want to caution you though, if when you are doing a formal screener, if there are 30 to 40% of your students who are screening positively for anxiety, that is a tier 1 issue. We will not be able to sort 30 to 40% of our kids in anxiety groups. So we need to take time and space during the academic time to elevate those skills and strategies for coping with stress and anxiety. So be really cautious in this space as you're creating those entrance criteria, those thresholds and red flags. And the first thing you need to ask yourself is, which tier are we going to focus on? So let's give another example. If you've got 10% of your students that are needing increased supports with anxiety, that's the time that we're going to start to create increased dose of support in a targeted manner at tier 2. So let me illustrate this example a little bit more with the screening piece. In the next slide, I want to give you a case study from a middle school, and this comes from Vanderstoep et al. From 2005. When we are screening, no matter if you're using an informal metric to uncover kids or you're using a formal metric, don't assume everybody's going to need specialty mental health services. So let me walk you through this. This is a middle school, 861 middle school students. They completed a screener for every single student in that middle school. Out of all of the students, there were 131 who screened positive. They had an elevated risk status. The cool thing that the school did is that they knew they were going to have a group of students that needed more supports, and they knew they were going to need to act really quickly. So they had already created a protocol that whenever a student screened positive on the screening, they would have hired short-term clinicians at the ready, and that within a 2-week time period after getting a positive screen, they would do an additional clinical assessment with those 131 students. So within a 2-week time period, they hired short-term clinicians to come in, do those diagnostic assessments, and then bring the results of that to the tier 2 team. The tier 2 team then looked at patterns and trends and did a deep data analysis and came up with 3 buckets of need. They came up with a group of students who needed academic supports. They had a group of students who need isolation and social adjustment supports. And they had a group of students with really clinical need and some technical expertise in the intensive end. But look at the percentages of students. Out of those 131 students, 24% of those kids with an elevated risk status needed academic supports. 47 needed to be encouraged to engage in a social and be socially connected. And only 13% of those 131 students needed that technical expertise. So again, when we start to look at data like this and start to look at patterns and start to chunk things in buckets of support, we're preserving our clinically trained staff for those kids with really intensive needs. And we're taking advantage of supports we already have available to us: homework club, tutoring, school clubs and activities. Now we're making it our mission to actively invite and engage those students into those things we already have in place. And again, it's going to be a little bit more tricky to do in this virtual learning space, but we can still create systems where we're putting in those buckets of support. So I wanted to take you through that journey of looking at screening data and having the teams kind of unpack that by not focusing on specific student needs, because that's where we go, right? Man, it's how do we help this one student? But thinking about how to anchor in these buckets. So I'll leave you with a cost piece. This took 50 minutes out of classroom instruction to conduct the screening, and there was some training that needed to happen with the adults. The triage assessment took about 43 hours for those 131 students. They did hire some short-term clinicians to conduct those assessments because they didn't have the staffing to be able to pull that off in a short amount of time. It was $9 to $15 per student to make this happen in the first quarter of the middle school year. How much will it cost if we wait? So I know that our budgets are going to be tight moving forward, and as we redesign the system, we're going to be hard pressed to figure out and mitigate those costs, but we cannot wait. What other data sources can you use right now to uncover needs? What are going to be your system level thresholds? When are you going to kick it up a notch? And this comes again from the brilliant mind of Steve Goodman, but he said something the other day that I thought was brilliant. Sometimes a request for assistance comes in that's a result of an academic diagnostic assessment, right? And that's the thing that triggered the request for assistance to go into the tier 2 team. When we pull in and have that multi-stakeholder group that's serving on the team, one of the things that's going to prompt are underlying needs that might be contributing to the academic result. For example, some of our students aren't getting their basic needs met. They don't have adequate food in the house. They might even not have a home to go to. That's going to impact our academic result. So as you're getting your request for assistance and your thresholds in progress, I want you to think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all of this. When a request for assistance comes in for one reason, I want you to think about unpacking what's behind that so that we can respond to the whole child need and not the one reason that it's coming to our attention. In the next slide, again, as you're thinking about your system level thresholds, I want you to think about those data-based decision rules, and we give some examples here. Student has 2 or more office referrals, let's kick it up a notch. Student has 2 unexcused absences, let's kick it up a notch. Student starts to decrease their homework completion and turning in their homework assignments, let's kick it up a notch. Notice that those thresholds are really tight and small, right? At 2, kick it up a notch. Too often our thresholds we wait too long, right? We wait till 9 unexcused absences and then we're like, oh, maybe we should do something. But that there's a fear factor in this. We're fearful that when we put these thresholds too small, that we're gonna overwhelm the system. Well, when we feel that we've got to run to get the Pepto-Bismol because our stress levels are high because we're overwhelming the system, it means we need to double down on prevention and double down on tier 1. So those thresholds are really, really important. Okay, next slide. Couple reminders, and then I'll turn it over to Jessica. So I showed this slide during our module 2, and I want to come back here because this kind of helps to construct tier 2 a little bit more. I want you to think of a continuum within tier 2. And at the basic level over here on the left, we can have our instructional staff, our teachers who are teaching math and teaching history, actually kick it up a notch right there in the classroom. So let's say I'm in a Zoom room tomorrow and I'm going to put my kids in different math groups. Why couldn't I on Fridays, because I know I've got a couple of my kids who are really dealing with a lot of anxiety and stress, why couldn't I pull them into a separate group in one of my Zoom breakout rooms and do some additional coaching and support and practicing my skills and strategies related to anxiety? My coping skills that I'm teaching everybody, but now they need a little bit more. There's nothing to prevent me as an instructional leader to kick it up a notch right there in my classroom setting. That won't be enough for some kids. So some kids will actually need a little bit more, and the dose will need to be occurring a little bit more frequently. So rather than doing that once a week inside with a classroom teacher, I have another group of students who would benefit from meeting outside the classroom time because they need just a little bit more. And then moving over a little bit more, we've got another group of students who might benefit from that coping skills strategy, but they might also need an emotional regulation piece. Now here's where I pull my technical experts in. And it might still happen within the Zoom room. It might dedicate a breakout room to have the clinician come in and provide that supports 2 times a week in my classroom. But the team needs to determine all of that, right? They need to consider when this is happening, what the dose, where the location is. And then finally, there's going to be a group of students who we might be inclined to put in intensive supports, but who could really benefit from, again, the targeted supports, but they might need a specific curriculum, right? They might need many, many modules on coping strategies. So we might add Coping Power, which is an evidence-based curriculum. And then we rely on our staff with expertise and technical skills, and we do it outside of the classroom time, and our dose is daily, right? These are the ways that our teams are, from a systems level, are going to work much more effectively and efficiently. Okay. So last thing before I turn it over to Jessica, your process for creating decision rules to access Tier 2, rely on your naturally occurring data sources. Make sure you've got multiple avenues for people to get support. Don't just look at data. Make sure that request for assistance is known by everybody. And at any time, even if it's not showing up on a data point, I know that there's a system where I can get support as a classroom teacher, and I've got students and family members that can also fill in a request for assistance. Because a lot of our behaviors don't show up in data points, right? A lot of us suffer in silence with anxiety and depression, and we could be getting straight A's, but being completely in trouble. And so how do we, again, craft a request for assistance process that allows that to happen? Decision rules or guidelines for determining access allow for flexibility, and make sure it's contextual. What may be low risk for one school might not be a low risk for another school.
This is great. Got a lot of good feedback, and I see we've got Q&A in the Q&A pod. So I'm going to ask Kelsey to share the Q&A pod with us so I don't further mess up my sharing situation right now. But Jennifer has got some great feedback. Don't just look at data. There are so many teams get tripped up by this process, and they kind of get stuck in I don't know, in like what particular data are we looking at, and what are our benchmarks there? This is really helpful.
Yeah, the only other thing I want to talk about with respect to this is I think that it's time for us to invest in a co-response model. And here's what I mean by that. When we have problem behaviors that we see in our classrooms and we are writing an office referral, there needs to be a co-response. Yes, administrator in charge of office referrals and figuring that out is good, but we also need our mental health partners to look at that with us to make sure that we're handling it with care and we're handling it with trauma-informed lens. So similar to how you're seeing this co-response occur where a 911 call comes in and a sheriff responds and the mental health clinician also responds to that home, we need to do that inside our schools. We need to be thinking about what are the underlying conditions. So as you're creating and crafting your new approach and as you're redesigning a trauma-informed approach, think or consider this kind of co-response model where we have a mental health provider and an administrator working side by side together.
I love it. I'm taking notes because for those of you that are in Oregon, you might know that Eugene, Oregon has a Cahoots. We have Cahoots. We have, I just wrote down, what's the decision rules for Cahoots? So if you make a call to the police, the emergency or non-emergency line, and there's a suspected mental health or drug issue, and people are acting erratically, they go through the process of decision. They send out Cahoots, which is their crisis response team, really well trained. I've got to see them work in action around town. And then the police officers also accompany, but they each have defined roles and responsibilities. And I'm gonna bug them later on this week about what's their decision rules. How do they determine that, and what does that look like? Because it's a great way to go. People are actually getting support and instead of harmed. This is good. Okay.
So I can briefly ask the question that's in the Q&A from Jeff. And I think it goes back to Susan providing some ideas for in virtual settings, having one teacher do the instruction with the other teachers supporting. And it was something they tried, and it worked well until they came back in person, and then the teachers had to go back to their own class and then back to distant learning, and that making the point that all these changes are causing uncertainty, and how do you build stability with all of these changes.
Yep. I think, you know what I think? The only thing we can be certain of is that we have strong relationships, and that we're going to be met with the relationships forward. Then that's all we control. We always want to control more in the school environment because we want our kids and families and teachers to be so successful. And so sometimes we kind of do within child or within family pathology instead of thinking about what we can control. And so I think it's yes, and it's hard. We're only going to have so many things that we can control. And we're going to go back and forth. And now that we've had that back and forth experience, now we may be able to identify places where we can create more predictability or more routines to allow the teachers to maintain that collaboration. Because you've got you have amazing ideas and dynamic creative problem solving within one school building, but not often in the course of the day do we facilitate the exchange of that information so folks can learn and grow together. So we're going to make some mistakes and hopefully learn from those, and then be able to create more predictability on the other side of that. It's kind of my first thought on that.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a co-teaching model, right? I would have never survived my first four years of teaching had I not had a master teacher co-teaching side by side with me. And when we brought our classrooms together, why can't we do that? We should be, disrupting status quo. How do we, if it's working in virtual and we can adapt that into the face-to-face, why not do it right now? We've got, now's the time to innovate, and never look back on what we did before. And that's hard to do when we're trying to normalizing, when we're all experiencing trauma. We want to resort to something that feels really comfortable. So it's hard to ask people to innovate at the same time you want so desperately to go back to what was. But we're going to have our teams really strike that balance.
Yep. It's great conversations and questions. I'm going to keep on moving through our slides here, talk about our request for assistance process. So we've got a sample request for assistance. This came from the Midwest PBS network website. And Susan was talking about the power of this uniform request for assistance. And remember, your district teams and even your school teams can't prioritize and allocate resources when we have different documentation, different types of data like we collect, different protocols across the district. We want to be able to efficiently aim our resources. So having a request for assistance that's uniform, but also is available to all of the range of folks in that school community to make a request. So a student can make a request for themselves. A student could make a request for a friend. They have a family member. I'm going to put a plug in for thinking about native languages, the languages, first language that people speak, and making sure that not only do we have this request for assistance, but that there's information about how folks can submit these requests for assistance, right? I joke that in my house, the request for assistance to the school is me being a loud, obnoxious mother to that school, but we actually want a protocol and a process for what this looks like across our schools here. Oh my goodness, who let me be in charge of this computer? This is what I said. Anyone should be able to fill out a request for assistance. It should be easy for folks to get in. And I love the example Susan gave about the screening for the middle school, because their process took 2 weeks and it was a big investment. However, it wasn't wait forever or wait for the new semester to start. Please don't tell me we have to wait for a new semester to start in order to provide access to supports, even something like an advisory or an academic seminar or a group where kiddos may get some kind of elective credit for our older kiddos. We really have to figure out ways around that so that folks can get the request for assistance completed, and that next level of assessment and intervention can happen quickly. And our staff really needs to know how to fill out that request for assistance. And this is when Susan was reminding us of anchoring to the tiered fidelity inventory. We have items in the tiered fidelity inventory at tier 2 and tier 3 that ask if we provided professional development for our staff on how to do this, right? And that means it doesn't go in the handbook. It goes in it's part of our regular how we do it, like the handbook we put on the shelf and we say, yeah, we have a handbook and it's got rainbows on it. It's actually, we talked at the beginning about building teacher fluency in trauma-informed practices. So making sure kids have access or that request is completed accurately in a timely manner is important. So let's talk a little bit about the self-assessment around the screening and request for assistance. And I'm hoping, look at my other slides here for a second, ground myself a little bit. This was kind of what we just rolled through here around screening and the kind of considerations for screening, and then this idea around what requests for assistance. And I like to remind folks getting familiar with ISF, with multi-tiered systems of support, including mental health, that the TFI is going to provide some benchmarks for our work. And remember that it's shaped depending on the needs of our kiddos. So let's talk a little bit about moving into some of the interventions to lean on the TFI here, particularly practices matched to student needs. This is one of my favorite items in the TFI. I'm kidding. They're all my favorite, is that all of our Tier 2 interventions should be aligned with behavioral function. So do our staff understand the maintaining function of problem behavior? Can that guide it? Because we know the science behind that. And we want to make sure we have a system that is designed to ensures that we're matching interventions to kiddo needs. So remember, like we said before, we don't jump right from Tier 1, it's not working, to individual problem solving, but we have interventions that we have in place and we're able to match student need. And we're really layering on top of that those protective factors that exist at Tier 1. And we want a formal process. We want a formal process here. And we're thinking about adapting to improve contextual fit. So is it within the culture, the developmental level? Is it something that's going to be kiddos are going to use? So think of check and check out for high school kiddos. We have lots of people ask us how to do that. And there's not a great social validity or contextual fit for a lot of our high school kiddos. So we don't try to force it. When we are thinking about, and this is part of the tiered fidelity inventory, we're thinking about how we're meeting student needs with our Tier 2 practices. We can look at the targeted interventions and the criteria for Tier 2. Okay, so we start with our function questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? These are our function. What's the maintaining function of the problem behavior? And then items 6 through 9 ask us, are we meeting the criteria of a Tier 2 intervention, right? So a lunch bunch can be a Tier 2 intervention if we're providing these components in that intervention. I love this graphic. It makes me really happy. So I think about functions and systems, the actual criteria of those Tier 2, and you can take your own, download this, take your own, and kind of click it in there. What are you providing in terms of function? Does it match what kiddos are seeking through their behaviors? Because behavior is communication. And then are we actually providing those systems? Do we have the systems built in to remind prompts throughout the day? At least 5 times we get positive feedback. There's at-home school communication, right? There's opportunities for adapting into a self-management system. And think about the strength of these interventions based on what it provides and kind of matching for kiddos. So this is I love this slide. Okay, we're talking about if check and check out is trauma informed. I love this. People ask if we talk about trauma. Is this stuff trauma informed? Well, are we dosing up on relationships? Are we thinking about skill teaching for self-regulation, right? Is that one of the things we're teaching there? Are we creating safety, predictability, and consistency with check and check out? Well, yes, we are. So we have these, the trauma-informed is not new. It's old wine, new bottle. It's something we run into. But look at the opportunities to dose up relationships through a check and check out process. And I've had schools say, well, we have some kiddos that have been identified as having some anxiety. They're going to carry the check and check out card. Don't gasp. They're not going to get ratings from teachers during the day. They're just going to hand the card to the teacher to check in with that teacher. The teacher's going to say, hey, I'm so glad to see you. How's your dog? What's going on? The card is just going to be the go-between, right? So we're dosing up relationships that are already part of a protective environment in the school. right? We are creating a higher dosage of skill teaching. And depending on what kiddos need, depending on the terms of their skill need from that manifestation of trauma, we're going to modify that, right? We may modify what expectation we're focusing on and how we operationalize that expectation for that kiddo. So we're going to be more specific and more intense related to the kiddo's needs. And you may have, remember, you're going to have vanilla check and check out where all kids are getting the same thing. And as our needs differentiate, if kids are not responding and we need to add more or be more specific, we can do that with the same framework of check and check out behind us. In fact, we have some slides to really focus on that. Okay. You can also add things like, here we go, start to modify it a little bit more and get away from that kind of blanket check and check out based on data and needs. Don't go right to individualizing check and check out. Write that down. You could tweet it. So you could add regulation to this process, right? So kids select a regulation activity when they come in the morning. You may have some modified check-in with a special facilitator, right? So I can lead a body scan with kiddos before we go back to class, or a grounding activity or some kind of regulation activity. So we're still building on the core. We teach, practice, and reinforce at tier 1. We're more specific at tier 2, and we're creating even more of that dosage for relationship building, predictability, et cetera. And we can add an additional component or layer for regulation, right? Because teaching self-regulation is such an important thing for us to do for kiddos who have experienced trauma. Okay, so we have this. This is a fun graphic here of how we're thinking about kids getting access to different interventions. And I think it's really important to point out this is a general and special education process. I feel very, very strongly about that. As a special educator, I can't stand the kind of silo and almost marginalization of funding based on the labels that we give to kids. And we really need to get rid of it. There's no reason for us to be holding on to that so tightly, because we can commingle that. So all our kiddos are getting this tier 1 universal support and this prevention. And in many instances, the check and check out is a really appropriate go-to as your first tier 2 when kiddos are not responding to that first level of need. It allows us to dose up a variety of things. And we do have, there's a moth flying through my forest right now. We do have some research studies that show that even kiddos with escape maintain behaviors at elementary school respond positively to check and check out, right? So check and check out is a nice, easy layer. And then we think, we think about modifying this based on function. What are the kiddos' behavior telling us? Is that kiddo need a more modified check and check out, something with a trauma response, or trauma responsive elements to it? Is this a social, academic, instructional group? So we're going to build in some more skill building within a specialized group, or is this something else? What else is this? Okay, and now this brief function-based problem solving. Function doesn't just exist here. We think functionally all throughout this continuum. I feel very strongly about this. We think functionally because when we make our best guess about if a kiddo is not responding at check and check out, we're still going to look at their current data and say, what can we infer? What's our best guess based on the data in front of us? And I don't really enjoy inference. Inferences in power. It's not a good thing in behavior support. We can look at their data and say, what are the data suggest right now is the maintaining function? If the kiddo's not successful here, then we engage in a little bit more of that problem solving, where we may need to collect a little bit more data. But remember, as the intensity of need goes up, the intensity and specificity of not just skill development, but also the assessment process and the data that we use to progress monitor also goes up. And then if we're not successful with, and this may be teacher or staff-led functional assessment or more data gathering, if that's not successful, then we drop into that more complex function-based problem solving, person-centered planning, a wraparound approach. Okay, which actually there's real research and recommendations on how you do wraparound. It isn't just sitting around a table and talking about a family. So here's our general flow of how we make it through. And as Susan will remind us, having decision rules about how kids get access. What are the flags, not how they get access? What are the flags? What are the markers that would lead us to believe that this is an appropriate next step for this kiddo? Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay, using function-based problem solving to make the next choice. Okay. So here is our targeted intervention reference guide. This is page 30 of the TFI. So please, you can download it, access this, put it up on the wall, share it on your screen as part of your tier 2 your tier 2 teaming. And here we have an activity here. We're not going to do this activity. This is a good activity for you to do. Okay, looking ahead at my other slide. So let's look at an example of a social academic instructional group. So the key features of this group, it's a small group, similar needs, is that we're going to teach a small, very specific set of skills. There's open enrollment, and it is connected to our tier 1 as a reteaching. So it can't be a second dose if there's not a first dose. So, and here's the problem solving. Here's our problem solving skills group. Here are some things we're going to be working on. And many of you already have access to really great social emotional curricula to help you have lesson plans around these specific things. So let's look at this layering of check and check out. Here we go, come on. Okay, so here's our kind of daily progress report or DPR or check and check out card. And this is what it generally looks like for all of our kiddos. When we start layering, we don't throw out what we already have because our teachers have already been trained and respond, and so are our kiddos. So we have a social academic instructional group may drill down and operationalize these expectations as the replacement behaviors for the skills that the kiddos are currently not demonstrating. So we're going to be even more specific about those replacement behaviors. For an individualized card for Mark, we've went through a function-based assessment process. He really needs, his respectful is operationalized as holding up a yellow card. And we just give him the one replacement behavior to start. So now we're layering. He's still using the daily progress report. Think of the power in being able to fade back to Mark is gaining success in his individual plan. We're moving back out to the social academic instructional group. We're going to fade out to just regular check and check out, right? Then he's going to self-monitor. Okay. Here's our replacement behavior for Mark. And then these are possible behaviors that may be taught in the previous SAIG groups. So we have 7 minutes, and I'm going to ask Susan to help us determine where we want to go to make the most of these last 7 minutes. And we also want to make sure that we give people time to fill out that evaluation.
Yeah, I think Kelsey has some final slides, so we can.
Excellent.
And thank you, Kelsey. We would love for you all to share a key takeaway. If you want to engage with us and put something in chat, that would be brilliant. So big ideas, systems are absolutely critical. We will spend a lot of time spinning our wheels by training on practices if the systems don't shape the behavior for the adults. And the best way to do that is through a multidisciplinary team approach where we're pulling in our community providers and our essential stakeholders into this work to give that expanded view, that expanded consideration. And so I know that one of the questions was around how do we create the feedback loops that are necessary to get that community buy-in and support when we're selecting a screener. Well, one of the things we want you to, that we talk about in ISF is expanding the current district leadership team to include those members of the community and bring them into the space of PBIS in a deliberate way and build relationships with them and create a community where we are very transparent about what we need to do and how it matches the needs and the context of the people that we're supporting. So we have very deliberate ways in ISF for you to engage with community partners. Mm-hmm. And then we wanted to offer some ways of getting started. So I know that this is a lot to take in. There's so much to try to accomplish. And so we wanted to offer some suggested starting points and some questions to ask as we invite Kelsey to give closing remarks.
All right, thank you both so much. It's always great to hear the information you have to share, and I do appreciate participants too who are willing to come forward and ask their questions and be interactive with us in the chat. So we're going to go a couple more slides, Jessica, to the slide that says West Coast ISF webinar series, just as a reminder of what is coming up next on Thursday. And then Susan and Jessica and our colleague Kurt Hatch from the Association of Washington School Principals will be with us to kick off Module 4 on ISF and equity in January. It's really hard to believe that we're talking about the month of January right now, but we are. So on the next slide, these are some additional learning opportunities that are coming up from both our Northwest MHTTC and the Pacific Southwest MHTTC that we hope that you will join if you find these things interesting and relevant to the work that you're doing. On the next slide, there are just a couple more resources around COVID-19, grief, loss, and bereavement, and our national network has a website where they bring together all the COVID-19 school mental health resources across the network. And then the next two slides are just a reminder of how to get in touch with the Pacific Southwest if you're in their region, and how to get in touch with us at the Northwest MHTTC if you are located in our region. And then the last slide is just a final thank you for being here today. And we hope that you will join us for our other sessions. And if there's anything that we can do to support you, you're welcome to reach out to any of us. So we will leave the webinar open for just a couple of minutes. You should be able to save the chat if you want to take those resources with you. I will put the link to the evaluation in the chat one more time so you have that. And I hope everyone has a good evening and a good rest of your week. Thanks again to Susan and Jessica for joining us today.